Okay, it's 7:30, and my name is Ace Hoffman, and this is, what did we call this? What a Waste. And we're going to talk about what the Department of Energy calls consent-based siting as a solution to the problem of nuclear waste. And I'm at a bit of a disadvantage for a couple of reasons. First of all, I have no formal training in the subject, although I have studied it for about 45 years, so 3/4 of my life. Also, I've attended approximately, well, more than 100 Nuclear Regulatory Commission hearings in California Public Utilities Commission. On Tuesday, I was in Sacramento for the California State Lands Commission hearing on Diablo Canyon, and a lot of phone hearings as well. I did let's see, about a 5-hour one today while I was preparing notes. The disadvantage is that you never get to talk for more than 3 minutes, and then on Tuesday they only gave us 2 minutes. So I'm supposed to talk for an hour and a quarter, and I don't know if I can pull that off. So, and I used to give lectures. I'm a computer programmer with 30 years or so experience in that, and I used to give lectures to, well, one of them was to the National Science Foundation. This was 25 years ago, on the use of computers in schools. And I gave a talk to a university, one of the ones to the professors in Los Angeles, and I spent as much time as I could preparing written notes. And I read from the notes for the first hour. It was a 2-hour presentation to these professors. And then afterwards I said, after I got done with the written part, I said, I don't have any more notes. I'm going to have to do the rest off the top of my head. And one of the professors came up to me afterwards and he said, lose the notes. So from that day forward, I never used notes for any of the presentations that I do. But now that I'm almost 60, sometimes I have little handwritten notes. And this time I have a whole sheaf of notes that I printed out today. And what they have are quotes from the Department of Energy and from the Blue Ribbon Commission. And if you recall, the Blue Ribbon Commission was formed by President Obama after canceling the Yucca Mountain project, which is not entirely canceled, and we'll get into all that stuff later on or throughout. And it was around from 2010 to 2012, and they made a couple of recommendations, which I think are basically useless. And then one of their recommendations was that they've got to move the problem of solving the problem of nuclear waste away from the Department of Energy and make it a separate organization, a separate agency. And so who's handling it now? The Department of Energy. And they had a representative come to the San Onofre is a closed nuclear reactor about 50 miles north of here. And it closed in 2012 when a steam generator leak occurred. And I forgot what this lecture was going to be on, and I kept thinking it was about the steam generator leak. There's a total of about 77,000 tons of nuclear waste in America. And most of it is stored on site at reactors, at nuclear power plants. Some of it is being moved into dry casks. A dry cask is about the size of a school bus. It has 1/2 to 5/8 inch thick stainless steel. It's big, round, and some of them are stored vertically, some of them are stored horizontally. At when DOE was here last week, they were attending the Citizens Engagement Panel, which is a misnomer. It's really the San Onofre, the Southern California Edison publicity stunt. It really is. They don't accept the first couple of meetings. They meet every quarter, and there's a couple of councilmen from local cities and so forth on that committee. And so they brought in the Department of Energy to come speak. And they said that the problem of nuclear waste is really not a technical one, that it's a political one. They said Yucca Mountain was closed because of politics. Well, that's not entirely true. It's true that all of Nevada is completely against the idea, but all they did was go out and get scientists to dispute the various findings that it might work. For example, water can drip into the Yucca Mountain site. And so they, at the last couple of years, they decided they were going to put 4-inch tall drip shields made out of titanium, 4 inches thick of titanium on top of each of these dry casks. Of course, they didn't design something to make sure that the titanium didn't fall onto the dry cask and damage it or anything like that. And then another problem was once the stuff starts leaking from the top or from the casks, which it eventually is bound to do, turns out that the water table underneath is not so far away and moving faster than they expected. And so it would bring the water here into California, which is utterly irresponsible and not permitted. We don't want all of Yucca Mountain's waste to end up in California. I'm from California, well, the last 25 years. So Yucca Mountain was stopped, and the Blue Ribbon Commission decided that the thing that they needed is this consent-based solution. And it was the Blue Ribbon Commission that came up with that concept, and it's the Department of Energy that's now pushing it as hard as they can. Okay, so let's get to some of these notes. And I guess what I want to do is, and anyone here can stop me at any time if they want something defined or something like that. So if we're going to talk about the problem is, there's 2 parts to the problem. One is the long-lived radioactive products, and the other one is the fission products. The long-lived products are uranium-235, plutonium-239. Those are the main ones, the fissile, transuranics, and the uranium. The short-lived products, the fission products, generally have a half-life of less than or about 30 years or less. Now, of course, a half-life means that after 30 years, half of the radioactive substance has decayed, possibly into another radioactive substance, and possibly into lead or some other non-radioactive substance. So for the fission products, we're talking about a total of maybe 600 years, 6 centuries before they're gone. But for the plutonium, that has a half-life of 25,000 years. And plutonium is also a heavy metal, so it's extremely toxic no matter what. The fission products often mimic useful elements in the body, and they have very short half-lives. A radioactive substance, this is just a brief, basic radiochemistry. The fission products are sometimes mimic things that the body needs, like strontium will mimic, I think it's calcium, and be a bone seeker, they call it. Other products mimic, like radioactive iodine mimics natural iodine and goes to your thyroid. So the short half-life is the danger, really. The problem with plutonium is that even though it has a 25,000-year half-life, a single microgram or a couple of micrograms, maybe 6 or 7 micrograms, is a fatal dose. It's enough to almost surely cause cancer. And a nuclear reactor takes uranium-235, which has a half-life of a million years or 1.2 million, I forget, 600,000, something very long like that, and breaks it down into these items with very short half-lives. And if the things with short half-lives get out, then we're in big trouble, but for less time. And this is all important because we really have 2 different kinds of storage problems that we need to take care of. One is for the long-lived things, and one is for the short-lived things. So one of the solutions, which was canceled by President Carter, is to reprocess the spent fuel, because once the fuel has been in a reactor, it's they take out maybe a third of it, or sometimes half of the fuel, and they theoretically can then remove the uranium that's still usable. Because what happens in the reactor is you get these fission products, and the fission products tend to go towards the outside of the fuel rods. So a fuel rod is about 12 feet long, as wide as your finger, and there's I don't know, tens of thousands of fuel rods inside of a reactor, about 200 in fuel assembly and maybe 150 assemblies. So, and then inside these long fuel rods are little things about this big, the size of your last bone in your pinky, that are a ceramic that's almost entirely uranium, mostly uranium-238, which is not a fissile isotope, but also 5% uranium-235. In the natural, when they mine it, uranium is 0.7% uranium-235. The reactors up in Canada use just natural 0.7% uranium. They don't have to enrich it for their type of reactor, called a can-do reactor. But one of the problems with the can-do reactor is it creates a lot of tritium, 30 times more tritium than the light water reactors that we use. So tritium is an isotope of hydrogen, and when tritium gets out, it can go anywhere in your body because it just attaches to another hydrogen and oxygen molecule atom and becomes water, and water, of course, is everywhere in your body. So the fuel rods, the fission products build up, and they block the ability of the uranium to split. The uranium splits by, when one atom splits, you get two fragments, which are usually approximately equal in weight, thereabouts, and those are the fission products, and a couple of neutrons go shooting off, and those neutrons hit other uranium atoms, and the process continues. It's a chain reaction. And it won't work if you don't slow those neutrons down, which is why there's water inside of a reactor. That's one of two reasons. Obviously, the other reason is that we're going to boil the water. Either boil the water directly, that's a boiling water reactor, or put the water through a steam generator, which is a series of tubes, thousands, 9,000 tubes, for example, in the ones at San Onofre, or two steam generators. So you can't, once you have a buildup of fission products, you can no longer get the neutrons to smash into enough other uranium atoms, and you have to take the fuel out and replace it with, quote, fresh fuel. And the other fuel, the one you take out, is called spent fuel. And the spent fuel still has a lot of it has a lot of uranium-235 in it. And it also has plutonium-239, which was not in the original fuel when it's put into the reactor, but it is produced from the bombardment of there's somebody here that can tell me. I think it's the uranium, but it might be the thorium, or one of the other, neptunium, I forget which one it is. But anyway, one of the other atoms in there, or one gets bombarded with neutrons and picks up a neutron, releases a beta particle, and becomes plutonium. So plutonium buildup means you now have two useful atoms inside the spent fuel, uranium-235 and plutonium-239. You also get plutonium-238, which has a much shorter half-life of, I think it's 83 years. And they can and do separate out the plutonium-238 to create a heat source that's used in some NASA rockets, like Cassini in 1996 had 73 pounds of plutonium-238 on it. And there's been a couple of other missions that have used that isotope. Yes?
That is not for the rocket, it's to power, it's nuclear batteries to power the spacecraft.
Right, that's absolutely right.
That's not what you said.
Well, I said it was used on a rocket, that's all I said.
It's not used in the rocket.
It's used as a power source on a satellite that's on the rocket, or in the case of a mission to Saturn, I guess you wouldn't call it a satellite, but it's on the probe that's on the rocket. They also use it as a heat source. So they have, on Cassini, they had 3 radioisotope thermoelectric generators, right? And that's what most of the plutonium was used for that. They also had about 130 little boxes about that big that were just for heating the equipment, so that because it's very cold out in space. And when in 1963 we had a rocket with 2.1 pounds of plutonium, a satellite with 2.1 pounds of plutonium on board, and that satellite fell back to Earth, and the plutonium was incinerated in the upper atmosphere. So Dr. John Goffman, who worked on the Manhattan Project, he was the first person to isolate plutonium for the Manhattan Project, calculated that that plutonium would cause lung cancer in about 1 million people. And essentially all of us are still pissing out a little bit of that plutonium every time we go to the bathroom. It's pervasive, it's throughout the environment.
Why isn't everybody dead? If that's so effective, your information is largely false. You have some details. I worked in that industry for 40 years. I know a great deal about the details. What you're providing is some factual information and a whole lot of scare stories. If what you're saying about plutonium is true, everybody on Earth should be dead.
How do you figure?
Well, you just described that amount, the amount that would cause cancer and allow people to die.
1 million people out of the entire population. Go off in Tampa and look at the statistics and say,
I know
theoretically.
Do you really think that 1 million people scattered all over the globe, all over the northern hemisphere, is going to be statistically noticeable? Do you think you're going to be able to calculate which of those people are and how they died?
Of course not.
Well,
Just
then
like
how can you say I'm wrong?
You know, did you ever hear the story that was made in a counter to that argument, that it is possible for one man to theoretically impregnate all the women on Earth? Theoretically.
Of course.
Of course, right? But is it practical? Is it likely? The answer is no. The reason? The delivery mechanism is inadequate. And the same is true for the distribution of material you described.
The plutonium is going to cause cancer in a proportion to the amount that you receive.
Portion
So-
might cause cancer, not will cause cancer.
If you get, what did I say, 6 to 10 micrograms of plutonium placed in your lung, you'll get lung cancer. That's virtually inevitable. If you take that same amount of plutonium that is inevitable to cause cancer in one person and spread it out to 100 people, the chances are, statistically, that one of those people will get lung cancer. If you spread it out among 1,000 people, statistically, one person will get lung cancer. If you spread it out among 7 billion people, statistically, one person will get lung cancer.
I think most of the people in the room here have some understanding of statistics, if not in a academic sense, at least in an intuitive sense.
While he's talking, I'm going to get a glass of water.
Go ahead, Ron. This is pointless. Yeah, you can't talk to a wall.
Did he correct anything, actually?
The other thing about RTGs is that they're, at least, now I don't know about the early 60s, but since the Apollo program, they have been designed so that they can withstand a Saturn V being on top of the explosion of a Saturn V fully fueled. Okay, there is one laying at the bottom of the Pacific from Apollo 13. It has not leaked radioactivity as far as we know, and by design it would not. It is designed to be able to also survive reentry into the atmosphere without a leak.
If you read the Cassini report, the environmental impact statement, that's not an entirely true statement. Yes, after SNAP 9A, that was the one that lost 2.1 pounds. After SNAP 9A, which had no containment around it because it's much more efficient to, as a thermoelectric generator, to attach the thermoelectric coupling directly to the plutonium without a casing. But after that accident, because of the outcry, as he said, they built a casing around it, which is made out of carbon fiber, mostly carbon fiber.
Depends on the particular one, but yes.
On that particular one, they're still using carbon fiber, as far as I know, when they use it. But at any rate, there were, as I mentioned, 3 radioactive thermoelectric generators. And in a reentry accident during the flyby, after it flew around Venus and then came shooting by Earth for a gravitational assist, if they had missed and had impacted Earth, NASA estimated that one of those RTGs would break apart. And those containments were not designed to protect against that. They simply weren't. And another accident that they were not designed to protect against is something called a full stack impact, I believe is the name, where the rocket goes up and turns around and pushes itself back into the ground. And in that condition, it would also release. And at any rate, the 130 radioactive heater units were not designed to withstand even a normal re-entry. So a late launch failure causing the rocket to fall back through the atmosphere, those would also have been destroyed. And that's all it's all in the Cassini Environmental Impact Report from 1995. And there's a seminar at 9 o'clock on memory. My memory's good enough for all of that stuff. I can show you the documents, but at any rate.
So you were talking about, before you left the nuclear reactor, you were talking about President Carter had stopped the reprocessing within the reactor.
Right, so he's not allowing us to reprocess that fuel and take out the useful uranium-235 and uranium-230 and plutonium-239. He's not allowing that, and I don't blame him because it's a very, it's a dirty process. It uses a lot of really dangerous chemicals, and there's always the possibility of an accident or terrorism or something like that. And the results, you can only do that maybe 2 or 3 times at most before there's just too much buildup of other isotopes that block the reaction. So it's not really, it wouldn't really buy us all that much. And as long as you can pull uranium out of the ground or use nuclear weapons uranium instead, because for a bomb, uranium has to be enriched to, I think it's 80% uranium-235. So you're going to downblend that in order to create fuel. So you could actually use, you get a good return on investment if you want to create nuclear fuel. I wish they had just said that they didn't want to hear this, but that's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about another way to reduce it, which is through gamma ray bombardment from a laser excitement later on. I think I started to mention that. I went to the Atomic Testing Museum last October, and one of the veterans who had experienced several atomic tests at Nevada described for me a system where you can actually break apart the U-235 and the plutonium-239 using lasers with an output of 10 to 15 megavolts, million electron volts, which means that we'll end up with a lot of more fission products, but we'll have made it so that the plutonium, the plutonium and the uranium are not available for weapons, which would be really nice. It would make it would eliminate the proliferation risk of the spent fuel, because right now any country that has a nuclear reactor, and as you know, Iran has nuclear reactors, and Russia, of course, and China's building 24 of them, 24 new ones. India, Pakistan, there's 30 or 40 countries that have them, and they are not all stable, and they're not all our friends. So if we could eliminate the danger of their spent fuel. On the other hand, I read yesterday that using lasers again, you can now separate up until now it requires some massive equipment in order to separate out the bomb-making materials. But again, with lasers, it looks like you can do this separation in a small room. All you need to do is get hold of the spent fuel, which is a little hard to do, but it's a lot easier if there's a lot of it around. So it would be nice to get rid of it. But the main advantage is that you reduce the storage time for just a second of the spent fuel from millions of years down to just half a dozen centuries.
Yeah, when I was working for the Department of Energy, I was a project manager on laser isotope separation. And the idea was we would take 235 from 238 using lasers, spend $1 billion on the plant, and then peace broke out, and all that extra uranium was thrown out in the market, and we mothballed the plant.
Okay, well, I don't think the idea is that you can do the neutralization with a desktop, tabletop laser. And right now it can't yet be done because lasers that output gamma rays in the 10 to 15 million electron volt range are not available. But that seems to be a pretty solvable problem. It just hasn't been worked on. How much money it would take, I don't know. But the amount of money that we're looking at spending in order to store the fuel, now that's pretty significant. Right now, it costs an estimated $8 million, between $5 and $8 million a year, just to watch the spent fuel. So if you've got a closed reactor site, if you have an open reactor site, the spent fuel is being watched by part of the security team that's already there to protect the reactor and the spent fuel pool. And so protecting the dry casks is not that much of an additional cost, maybe $1 million a year, if that. But if you're a closed reactor site, you need that entire security system just for the dry casks. So it's costing $8 million a year at every reactor site that's closed just to store the fuel. So the Department of Energy and the Blue Ribbon Commission wanted to come up with a plan for convincing some community to hold the nuclear waste. And that's really what this talk was supposed to be about, not so much this background and the other discussions of Cassini and so forth. And that's why they came to San Onofre, was to discuss consent-based nuclear waste. And that's also why the Department of Energy has gone to, I have here a list of, they've gone to, I think, 8 different cities. Tempe, Arizona was the last one last week, to try and drum up support for the consent-based solution to nuclear waste. The interesting thing is they're not going to anywhere that might be a community that'll take the waste. They're going to communities that want to get rid of the waste to try and, I guess, convince those communities just to push other communities, and they're waiting for some place that will want to take the waste. There's a place in Texas that had kind of offered. The Texas Democrats last week or so came up with, I think there's 4 Democrats in Texas, I'm not sure. But they came up with a statement that they don't want the waste, and of course the community around whatever that site is, they don't want the waste either. There's a place in New Mexico, and it's basically the same kind of problem, that nobody wants to take this waste. So the main thing that they've come up with is that they need incentives. Now I think a better word for an incentive is a bribe. And the problem is you can only bribe the current generation. You can't bribe the children that are going to be stuck with this waste in the future. Now here at San Onofre, we have about 50 dry casks of waste stored 200 feet from the coast. There's huge canyons right off the coast. And one of the workers at San Onofre told me that the casks are good to 50 feet of submersion. I don't know if that's true, but I doubt that it's more than that. And the tsunami in Japan, of course, those waves were 60 feet tall. The dry casks are only maybe 20 or 30 feet above sea level here at San Onofre. There are some hills behind San Onofre, behind the reactor and the spent fuel site. And a couple hundred feet up those hills are stones, sea stones, rounded stones. And that's indicative of a very large tsunami, which was probably caused by these underwater canyons that are off the coast. So if you may recall, 200,000 people died in a tsunami in Banda Aceh in 2000 or 2001, and that was caused by an underwater landslide, those tsunami waves. So not directly by the earthquake, but actually by the landslide. There was in Alaska, there was a tsunami caused by a landslide, and those waves, I think it was 600 feet high. So 50 feet is not enough. The San Andreas Fault, of course, is going to shake any day now. And whether or not it would be able to cause an accident at San Onofre of the spent fuel in the dry casks, I don't know. It's probably more of a danger to Diablo Canyon, unless, of course, it causes one of these underwater landslides. Now, those 5/8 inch or 1/2 inch thick stainless steel canisters that they're using are susceptible to what's called stress corrosion cracking, or chloride-induced stress corrosion cracking. And that won't occur until the temperature on the surface of the cask goes down sufficiently so that the salts from the sea air can crystallize in microscopic cracks or microscopic, an insect shell is enough to start a crack, or an insect jaw, or your fingernail, or any equipment that it rubbed against. The casks cannot be inspected. Even if they could be inspected somewhat, there's no way to inspect, and they have to admit this. The Southern California Edison has admitted that they're trying to research how to inspect them, but where the casks are supported, the stress points are particularly likely to have a crack form, and they're particularly hard to inspect.
Why can't they inspect?
The casks are stored in large, 2 or 3 feet thick cement with very little room between, enough for air to circulate because they're cooled by air. And as to exactly why they can't be inspected, I don't know. I only know that they do not have a way to inspect them. And San Onofre assures us that they're working on that. But then again, even if they can inspect most of it, the most critical areas are going to be quite difficult to inspect. Robotics? I don't know. Nobody's tried. In Europe, they're using dry casks that are more like that thick. And some of the activists around San Onofre have been advocating for our using those dry casks. But because the ones we're using are cheaper, and they're also lighter, so theoretically they'll be easier to transport. But mainly because they're cheaper, San Onofre and the other reactor companies prefer the casks that they're using. Whether or not they can last long enough, the DOE admitted that it's going to be decades before any site, whether it's an interim storage site or a consolidated storage site or a permanent repository, becomes available. If Yucca Mountain were going to be built, most of the fuel would actually sit outside the mountain for decades. So So they don't have a solution for the waste. Now, let's see if I can go to some of these notes. Siting processes for waste management facilities should include a flexible and substantial incentive program. Does that sound like a bribe to you? Sure does to me. Says that it could take 15 to 20 years to establish site identification, and possibly it could be done in 5 to 10 years if they, and that's just finding the place. It doesn't include designing. In 1982, the National Waste Policy Act created what's called a polluter pays funding mechanism to ensure that the full costs of disposing of commercial spent fuel would be paid by the utilities, which means, of course, the ratepayers, and not impact the federal budget. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I don't know, they've collected, I think it's about $20 billion, $17 billion into this Nuclear Waste Policy Act, into this fund. It says here it was $27 billion a couple of years ago. And they're not allowed to use that funding for an interim storage site or a consolidated storage site. They're only allowed to use that for a permanent waste disposal site. And since there is no permanent waste disposal site, even though the government promised to move the fuel in by 1997 or 98, between that time and now, the reactor companies are suing the federal government, have successfully sued the federal government to get paid for the cost of storing the fuel after they take it out of the reactor. But they're not allowed to use the funding for the permanent repository. So that money is coming directly out of the federal budget and from the taxpayers, not just the ratepayers. So taxpayers are paying, I think San Onofre collected $300 million just from that fund. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's causing an enormous problem. What Darrell Issa would like to do is to start taking the interest on that $27 billion and using that to pay off this money, and also using it to try and that incentive program that I call a bribe. The Blue Ribbon Commission, which of course was only from 2010 to 2012, cited in their report the success of WIP, which is a waste isolation pilot project. I forget what the last two initials is. They cited WIP as an example of how you could successfully convince a community to take the waste. And of course, last year or the year before, they had an explosion of nuclear waste inside of WIP. Is it open yet? I don't think it's completely reopened. Maybe part of it is reopened. But it would be difficult to cite it as a success story anymore.
Where's that at?
That's in New Mexico. And so WIP, which was that was the best that they've been able to come up with. They also try to suggest that other countries have succeeded in using a consent-based solution, but they're all just beginning to do their waste projects. And for example, Finland, I think it is, plans to put their waste in copper, surrounding it in copper, which is a lot more expensive than stainless steel, and then deposit it deep inside of a mine shaft. And the problem there, in granite, I believe it is, the problem is that they're going to introduce oxygen into that environment, and the oxygen is going to cause the granite to crack over time. It's a different environment from one of being 1,000 feet or 800 feet underground with essentially no oxygen at all, and no room for any oxygen. So whether or not that's going to be a success story could take 10,000 years to find out for sure, because they're not reducing the plutonium. They're not using this method discovered or patented by, it's actually patent pending, by Peter Livingston, the guy I interviewed in, at the Atomic Testing Lab last October. See, my wife over there and I, we went to the, we visited the Atomic Testing Lab and discovered that they were going to have a reunion of the veterans who had worked on either on the bomb or on the cleanup. And a lot of the veterans who were involved with the cleanup are not listed as atomic veterans. So even though they were cleaning up after a bomb blast, sweeping off ships and moving rubble and building this gigantic dome that they just put everything in, and they're suffering. Some of them landed, they parachuted, this would be the 101st Airborne, were instructed to land directly onto a bomb site within about 45 minutes after the bomb blast. And I remember the guy that was talking about it said, all of my friends are dead. And you know, of course, at his age, that's not really all that surprising that they've passed, but they had all, you know, basically died of cancers of one sort or another. It's really a terrible, terrible situation for them. So, how did I get on that subject? Yes, and one of them was this Peter Livingston, who had worked on the electromagnetic pulse from atomic bombs. He said it's very simple, it follows the Maxwell's equations, and he's got this patent pending on reducing the spent fuel with gamma rays in the 10 to 15 million volt electron volt range. I have not heard a single word from the Department of Energy, and there is nothing in the Blue Ribbon Commission report that I spent all day today reviewing about that, about reducing the toxicity of the waste so that you no longer have to worry about it for 100,000 years. You only have to worry about the fission products for, you know, 6 centuries or maybe 1,000 years. Now there are 7, and one of the pages in my book mentions them, there's 7 isotopes of fission products that that are long-lived, that not like technecium-99, which is used for medical purposes if you get if you have a heart test or there's a wide variety of reasons why they'll use that, and that has a, you know, I don't know, 8-hour half-life, I think it is, 2-hour half-life. But there's another isotope of technetium that has about a 1,000,000-year half-life. So you're never going to completely solve that problem, but those are in trace amounts compared to everything else. So really reducing, getting rid of the plutonium and the uranium, the 239 and the 235, that's a big deal. And it could even be a profitable, or at least not an expensive proposition, because this heat, it gets released, and that can be used to turn a turbine, just you know, or in some other way to you know, industrial heat is useful in all kinds of ways. Spent fuel reprocessing or recycle options generate waste streams that require a permanent disposal solution. That's a quote from the Blue Ribbon Commission. And as I mentioned, they think that it was stopped because of politics, but I don't think that's fair. So I think I'll just read some quotes here. The arguments in favor of consolidated storage are strongest for stranded spent fuel from shut down plant sites. Stranded fuel should be first in line for a transfer to a consolidated facility so that these plant sites can be completely decommissioned and put to other beneficial uses. Now, the reason they want to do it that way is because of that $8 million that I mentioned earlier that it costs for security. If you can consolidate the fuel onto one site, then you know it's going to be a little bigger site, but you can completely at a closed site like San Onofre, you can get rid of the security issues. So that's why they want to take the fuel that way. But there's the reactor companies are not required send off their latest fuel, they can actually send some of the hotter fuel if they want to. So without changes in the laws, there's no guarantee that they're even going to be able to do it that way. Let's see. To allay the concerns of states and communities that a consolidated storage facility might become a de facto disposal site, a program to establish consolidated storage must be accompanied by a parallel disposal program that is effective, focused, and making discernible progress in the eyes of key stakeholders and the public. Progress on both fronts is needed and must be sought without further delay. This is from a report from 2012. And this is after 30 years of studying Yucca Mountain. So even with timely development of consolidated storage facilities, a large quantity of spent fuel will remain at reactor sites for many decades before it can be accepted by the Federal Waste Management Program. And basically what that's saying is they don't have a solution, and they're not even close to it. So here's a list of eight points of what it is they need. A new consent-based approach to siting. That's one. A new organization to implement the waste management program. So that's what the Blue Ribbon Commission suggested, but instead the Department of Energy is handling it. Access to utility waste disposal fees for their intended purpose. That's taking the money away from the permanent repository plan and putting it into these temporary plans. Prompt efforts to develop a new geologic disposal facility. When Yucca Mountain was picked, they had originally they had looked all over for how to take care of the waste. They considered rocketing it to the sun, which we still have rocket failures at the rate of 15 to 20% of the rockets. So that, and it's way too expensive for 77,000 tons of fuel. It would never work, and it's been dropped. And so they reduced it to 3 sites, and one was in Kansas, and Yucca Mountain was another one, and I can't remember where the third one was. I guess I should go to that seminar at 9. But at any rate, the Kansas one was in a salt mine, and they eventually decided that, I don't remember, it was because Kansas really didn't like the idea. I'm sure they didn't, and the other site as well. But they reduced it down to 1 site, Yucca Mountain. And if the Yucca Mountain team was allowed to come up with any other idea, if they could, the only thing they were not allowed to consider was a geologic disposal at a different site. Yucca Mountain was decided as the site, but they had already looked all over the country for anywhere else that might be adequate for taking it. So how are you going to develop a new geological disposal site when we've already looked at them all? So prompt efforts to develop one or more consolidated storage facilities. Now this one I find really interesting, because I've mentioned to the San Onofre Citizens Engagement Panel on several occasions, well, why don't we just send the waste to Palo Verde nuclear power plant, where they already have a security system, they already have dry casks, and what's 150 more dry casks? That's the entire number of dry casks that they're planning on having at San Onofre, right on the coast, right in an earthquake zone, surrounded by 50 million people within a 30-mile radius. They have 3 million people at Phoenix, and that's something like 60 miles away from Palo Verde. Well, they don't want the waste, and I can't say I blame them, but what are we going to do? Where's a better solution? Where else are we going to put the waste? Right now, it's at 70 sites around the country. Every one of them is vulnerable to terrorism, to an airplane falling out of the sky. You may have heard today a Tesla auto car drove under a tractor trailer truck, and the driver was killed. It's the first accident with a Tesla autopilot, auto-controlled car. And what happened was it was a bright sunny day, and it was a bright truck. The side of the truck was bright, and it was making an illegal left turn. and the car just smashed right into it. The driver never put on his brakes, apparently was not looking at all. They're not supposed to drive that way. And of course, we know about German wings, and we know about MH17, and we know about MH370, and we know about a Egypt air crash in the St. Lawrence. At least 3 of those were the pilot intentionally crashed, or a co-pilot intentionally crashed that jet.
The B-52s in somewhere in the east and in Spain.
Right, we also know about a B-52 in Palomera, I think it's how it's pronounced, something like that, in Spain, which simply crashed. So every one of these sites is vulnerable to an airplane strike, either accidental or on purpose. So they need something better. San Onofre might be trying to get something better because they've decided they're going to use a different system. Instead of just having a flat cement base and the dry casks sitting on it like a series of Coke cans on a table separated by enough room to get between them. At San Onofre, they're going to have a sunken base, and then it's like a honeycomb-shaped island, independent spent fuel storage site. So they're going to put the dry casks inside of a cement island, and they're going to be surrounded with cement and with about a 3 feet of concrete on top of them, and metal covers. And the metal covers are very thick, and I believe that's to protect against airplane strikes. I don't know for sure why they're doing it that way instead of the way they're doing it at Diablo Canyon, for instance, which is just a big flat surface with the dry cask just sitting there. But that's my belief, is it's to protect against airplane strikes. The only problem is that I don't think it'll work, because the National Science Foundation, National Academy of Sciences, NAS, like 10 years ago, did a study, and most of it is classified, and I can't tell you what the classified part says because I don't know. But it was pretty clear that they do understand that the fuel, the jet fuel, if that fire can burn for more than about 20 minutes, can destroy a dry cask. And if that happens, the fuel can, the radionuclides in there can start to get out. And if they actually crash into a dry cask, perhaps the plane itself wouldn't do damage, but the turbine shafts on the 4 engines of a 747 probably can go right through a dry cask, and if you push that fuel together, you could cause a criticality event, which is like sort of like a nuclear reactor, but just very brief. It would be a terrible explosion and release of fuel all over the place. One estimate is that it could be statistically significant deaths as much as 500 miles downwind, whatever statistically significant means in this instance. So what the NAS recommended was that there would be runoffs for the fuel so that it could not stay in the vicinity for 20 minutes. But the dry cask system that they're building at San Onofre does not have those runoffs. And there's vents because there's air circulation. So if the fuel got in, there'd be no way for it to get out.
Is there a historic precedent for something similar like that happening ever?
No, absolutely not. We would consider it on a scale of well above 3 Mile Island and hopefully below Chernobyl and Fukushima. So no, it has never happened.
With this answer, you should be sent to Siberia. Fission.
I should be sent to Siberia?
You should be sent to Siberia.
Okay, hear that.
He says that I should be sent to Siberia because I'm afraid.
Where something like that happened, actually. So
What was?
the Russians had a big accident of stored fuel. I mean, it wasn't dry casks, but it was their fuel storage, and basically a lake blew up and contaminated large areas. So it's just data that you might present. It's available.
Okay.
make your point.
He said that there was an accident in Russia of spent fuel that contaminated a large area. Is that a good summary?
Yes, and I mean, this is, okay, yeah.
Okay.
It's correlated to the example that you just gave of the airplane flying into the dry cast and exploding it.
Yeah.
What you're having is you have a breach of containment, and what happens with a breach of containment, there is historical precedent. And I mean, your argument is valid in the sense that yes, there is historical precedent.
And you can't put water on these fires for one reason, because you can't get close enough to a dry, one little pellet you can't even, you can't get near. So a dry cast with hundreds of thousands of fuel pellets, if those are released, you're gonna have a lot of trouble getting near it. And water isn't gonna put it out anyway. What it might do is cause a criticality, because it will slow those neutrons down, and then, well, then you can have a criticality. So, because there's still activity in spent fuel. Back to this list, we got through prompt effort to develop one or more consolidated storage facilities, and I said, well, why not start using the open reactor sites to store the fuel from the closed reactor sites? And I guess one thing that would cause is a rush to close your reactor before you become a spent fuel storage site for other reactors, which is fine with me. Number 6 here, early preparation for the eventual large-scale transport of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste to consolidated storage and disposal facilities. I think it was 2003 or something that I went out to Nevada, and the Department of Energy was holding a hearing about Yucca Mountain, explaining how good it was going to be, because it would provide jobs for the community for many years. And they had pictures of trucks that they were going to design to carry the waste. But they did not have any trucks to carry the waste. Nowadays, they plan to ship it by rail, but we all know that our rail infrastructure is in terrible shape. So every bridge would need to be probably reinforced, not just inspected. And not just the bridges they go over, but also the bridges they go under. You might remember an accident of a bridge falling down onto a highway in Minnesota, I think it was. That would absolutely cause an accident that would be statistically significant 500 miles downwind.
Now, okay, if I'm thinking about how long these fission products last, I mean, kind of, what I'm not thinking about bridges or something, I'm thinking about Troy, the city of Troy, which has 10 layers of city which got burned down and rebuilt. And that's about a fifth of the time that stuff lasts. Right,
that's why I really want to see this plutonium and uranium reduction to occur, so that we only have to worry about 1,000 years worth of fission product decay, roughly 1,000 years, instead of 100,000 years worrying about this.
In Germany and France, or one of those countries, you can't even transport across radioactive materials across that to ship it to other countries. So they pass laws to prevent the transportation. So there are obviously some countries that are forbidding that kind of transport.
Yeah, they do transport it in Germany, and there's enormous protests against the transport. The DOE assures us that they're going to inform and get permission from every community that this waste would have to be transported through. And lots of luck, yeah, because for one thing, they're not going to want to tell you when, if they tell you when they're going to transport it, then it becomes more of a security risk. So, and when we were, a lot of activists were trying to get San Onofre closed. This was 5 years ago, and before the steam generator problem. And so we went to city after city after city. We went to the city councils and we talked to them. Eventually we realized that some of the solar power companies were following us around, and after we would get up and talk about the problems with nuclear reactors, and this was after Fukushima but before San Onofre was shut. So we talk about the problems with nuclear reactors, and the solar companies would come in and talk about the alternatives and how successful they were, and that they wanted the cities to help, and the cities do help. But we also went to the emergency management people, some of their meetings, and where they had outreaches for various public reasons. And we would ask them what their plans were in case of an accident at the plant that was open, 25 miles away, 30 miles away. Invariably, all they ever could tell us is, well, we don't know, but we'll get told by the feds will tell us what to do. That's no way to run a evacuation plan for a radiological disaster. The local, the sheriffs, and the police and the fire department all need to know what's going on and what to do, and they do not know, and they've never known. They've never been told. Okay, well, number 7 here is support for advances in nuclear energy technology for workforce development. I don't know what that's doing there, other than that if they reprocess the fuel and keep if they succeed in finding a way to store the waste in an interim or consolidated or a permanent repository, and noting that Yucca Mountain, if they were to have opened it, there's already more fuel than would fit in it. But anyway, if they succeed, then that is a green light for nuclear reactors to stay open. If they don't succeed, then the nuclear reactors all have a much less reason to stay open, because they've got no solution for the waste, and it's costing taxpayers and ratepayers money just to store that waste. And there's of course the risk of having it stored on site, which everybody agrees is much more dangerous than if we could get it into a permanent repository. And then number 8 is active U.S. leadership in international efforts to address safety, non-proliferation, and security concerns. Well, yeah, we would like to see that happen, of course. We want to see the other countries do as well as we would like to do with nuclear waste. Okay, this page is called Tying It All Together. This is the end of the summary from the Blue Ribbon Commission, which is the blueprint for the Department of Energy. It says the overall record of the U.S. nuclear waste program has been one of broken promises and unmet commitments. And that's not me, that's Obama's Blue Ribbon Commission. And yet the commission finds reasons for confidence, that's definitely not me, that we can turn this record around. This was written 4 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. To be sure, decades of failed efforts to develop a repository for spent fuel and high-level waste have produced frustration and a deep erosion of trust in the federal government. But they have also produced important insights, a clearer understanding of the technical and social issues to be resolved, and at least one significant success story, the WIPP facility in New Mexico. Moreover, many people have looked at aspects of this record and come to similar conclusions. Well, if you ask enough people, you're going to get some that are going to agree with you, especially if you go to the nuclear reactor sites and say, we're going to shut you down if we don't solve this. How do dry casks sound? And they'll say, well, they sound fine. To a nuclear reactor company, they're going to sound fine. Here we have this section was called Linkages Between the Back End of the Fuel Cycle and the Future of Nuclear Power. The successful management of spent nuclear fuel has long been viewed as necessary for nuclear power if nuclear power is going to remain a viable energy option. Of course, last week, Diablo Canyon announced that they're going to close down, and another dozen reactors have closed or announced that they're going to close in the last couple of years, almost invariably due to the finances. That fracked natural gas is too cheap for a nuclear reactor to compete with it. And that cost is, of course, going to go up, but solar panels that are thinner than human hair have been developed. And wind turbines. I drove up, as I said, to Sacramento on Monday, and I went to San Francisco, to Berkeley first, to stay at a friend's house. And if you go through the Altamont, I think it's called the Altamont Pass, there's all wind turbines all over the place. And I hadn't been up there in a couple of years, and I realized that all the wind turbines, or a large number of them, are much bigger than they were last time I was there. Wind power is getting much cheaper, and so the ability to compete with that is going to get impossible for nuclear power plants. They're all going to have to close just simply because they can't afford the repairs. They can't afford the workforce. They got 1,500 people working at Diablo Canyon. I asked a solar powered installer down at the, we have a fair in the county, like every county, it's called the San Diego Fair. Right now, Brian Wilson is, of the Beach Boys, is performing right as we speak, which is undoubtedly the reason this room isn't full. And so would have been the reason I'm not here. But I asked the solar installer there, how long does it take, say, with a crew of 3 to install a solar panel on a roof? He told me 1 day. And I asked when I was in Sacramento at the hearing, the woman sitting next to me, her son is a solar panel installer. And I asked her if she would ask him, and she texted him right there while I was at the meeting, without telling him what the other one had said. How long would does it take? It's 1 day. I did ask one other person who said it would take them 3 weeks, but I think he was working alone. And maybe had a different, so 1,500 employees at Diablo Canyon can install 2,500 solar installations in a week, which is 125,000 in a year. Diablo Canyon's gonna stay open for 8 years. That's enough time to install almost enough solar panels to replace all of the power from San Onofre, from Diablo Canyon's 2 large reactors. They're 1,100 megawatts each. We have more than 15,000 or 150,000 unemployed people in California alone. It's a state of 38 million people. So we could install 2 million solar. There was a plan 15 years ago or so called the million solar roofs plan, which I don't think came to fruition. But there's many millions of roofs in California that could be turned into solar. I just realized I've gone over my time. Or no, I have 6 minutes left.
But
Yes.
another thing about solar is you read is there's been a slow increase every year in the percentage efficiency of how much sun and energy you're getting and the amount of electricity you can get out.
Perhaps more interesting is the return on investment. On average, if you have solar on your roof, the value of your house goes up by $15,000, which means if you had 2 million solar roofs, so you've completely replaced Diablo Canyon, you've added $30 billion to the homeowners' values. And there's just no way that Diablo Canyon can compete with that kind of added value to the state's housing. Yes, sir?
No, you're really oversimplifying the solar installation a bit. I'm having hopefully over here, I'm having a commercial solar system put on my apartments. And it's not an easy thing to do. You get all kinds of permits, roofing inspections, and the actual installation is the easy part of it. But preparation and it's quite expensive. The return is there eventually, but it doesn't just happen in one day like you're talking about. But another point I've wondered about for a long time, why can't this nuclear waste be encapsulated, closed in some kind of ceramic cases, and dropped in a deep trench in the ocean, where it will gradually dissolve over thousands of years and never, they'll never be able to detect the amount of it that dissolves into the ocean. It seems like such a simple solution, and nobody's been able to really explain to me why that can't be done.
Well, the quick answer is that the 235 and the plutonium-239, you have to worry about them for hundreds of thousands of years. So
It'll gradually dissolve and be dispersed in the ocean, and it'll never be detectable.
It was said at one time.
I'm going to ask. This one.
We mined it all up.
Yeah, we had ground to begin with.
It's been suggested, we have these things called subduction zones in the ocean, where the ocean curve is slowing down. You put it there, and it goes all the way down in the middle of the earth, and it's gone for 60 million years. That's what's been suggested. But you put it in a trench, it goes all, will go into the rest of the ocean. You're just diluting it. Why didn't you just put it in the subduction
It'd be so
zone?
diluted, it'll be undetectable.
No. Subduction zone, just get rid of it. Goes down to the middle of the earth, where all the uranium is anyway.
The Yucca Mountain team was allowed to consider all of those plans, and they rejected them all for technical reasons.
One of the things that happened on Yucca, I know of somebody that worked on the planning of that, and they had, I don't know the numbers, but they said, well, you have to have it so it's safe for, say, 1,000 years, okay, and at a certain level. And then when they planted, then they kept shoving that back, so it's not, oh, well, we decided it's gonna be, pressure groups cause this 10,000 or 100 million years or whatever. So they changed the statistics on what you had to achieve.
Yeah, they did, and they eventually came up with I think it was 1 million years.
Yeah.
And we can't do math or science or statistics.
Yeah,
We
you
can't,
can't.
there's no way we can calculate what's going to happen in 1 million years, which made it impossible to come up with a
Right.
reliable scientific solution. But again, with the water transport problems underneath and coming down, and part of the Yucca Mountain cave system collapsed. So those could be problems much sooner than that, and plus there's volcanic activity and some earthquake activity in the area. So whether or not Yucca Mountain would work, I don't know. But I think we can find solutions that will work for 1,000 years, which means if we can get rid of the plutonium and the uranium, the fissile materials, we practically have the problem solved. Whether or not we have it solved good enough to bother keeping the reactors operating, well, that's a whole different story, because reactors have, they have their own problems where, a reactor operator can cause a meltdown the same way the Germanwings pilot flew his plane into the ground, or the MH370 pilot flew his plane into the ground or into the ocean. A reactor operator, all he has to do is flood the reactor with cold water, and that's going to crack the reactor. And the way that that's prevented is they're trained not to do that. So let's hope that they don't. And my time is up now. So I want to thank all of you who stayed, and I really wish the people who were arguing with me would have stayed the most. Not that I would have taught them anything, but they might have taught me something. Especially if they came up afterwards and browbeat me. But because that's how I learned this stuff. Peter Livingston, the guy talking about the reduction, he's totally pro-nuclear. One of my best friends are pro-nuclear. You have to do it that way. This is America. We want civil discourse, and nothing else is going to work. And in fact, I just want to close with saying one thing. I've been going to nuclear reactor hearings for 20 years on San Onofre and up at Diablo Canyon. Not one time has anybody from that plant been rude to me. Not a single, and they all know who I am, and they know what I'm going to say, more or less. And since I don't prepare my notes, nobody knows exactly what I'm going to say. But they're some of the nicest people, and that's the way I like this planet to work. They're good people, and they care about what they're doing. They're not biologists. They haven't interviewed all the people I've interviewed. They haven't read the books I've read. They don't have a collection of 500 books like I do. But they're sincere workers, and they're good people. So I'd like to see the problem solved properly. And thank you again.